Out of those U.S. airstrikes on a handful of targets in Iraq and Syria that the Pentagon says are tied to militias backed by Iran. Those retaliatory strikes actions in that region. National security correspondent Courtney Kuby is here with the details. Courtney, what more do we know?
Well, Peter, U.S. F-15s targeted an Iranian-backed militia today, striking 5 locations in retaliation for a deadly barrage of rockets that killed an American last week. In a statement, the Pentagon said the group, Kataib Hezbollah, has a strong linkage with Iran's Quds Force and has repeatedly received lethal aid and other support from Iran used to attack U.S. and coalition forces. U.S. officials say the militia has conducted 11 rocket attacks against coalition bases in Iraq in the last 2 months. The largest last Friday, when militants fired more than 30 rockets at a base near Kirkuk, killing an American contractor and wounding 4 U.S. troops. On Saturday, Defense Secretary Mark Esper briefed President Trump on a U.S. military response, which required presidential approval, striking 3 locations in Iraq and 2 in Syria. The U.S. is still assessing whether there were any casualties on the ground.
Officials say U.S. forces conducted strikes in Iraq and Syria against 5 facilities that were tied to an Iran-backed militia.
An Iranian-backed militia in Iraq now calling for U.S. forces to be pushed out of that country. This comes after a series of U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria targeting these militias. Overnight, Iranian-backed militia in Iraq now calling for U.S. forces to be pushed out of that country. This comes after a series of U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria targeting these militias. CNN's Arwa Damon is live in Istanbul with the very latest rising tensions in an already tense region. Arwa.
Yeah, and that might even be an understatement, John, given how serious the situation is, with Iraq basically telling both Washington and Tehran to stop using it as a proxy battlefield. Iran also has now warned of grave consequences following these strikes, which, according to the Pentagon, targeted 5 areas, 3 of them in Iraq. Iran also has now warned of grave consequences following these strikes, which, according to the Pentagon, targeted proxy battlefield. Iran also has now warned of grave consequences following these strikes, which, according to the Pentagon, targeted 5 areas, 3 of them in Iraq, 2 of them in Syria. The Pentagon saying that they were going after arms depots, weapons depots, as well as command and control centers belonging to this Shia militia known as Kataib Hezbollah. It is backed by Iran and was in fact one of the militias that the U.S. put under this umbrella called the special groups that were especially militias that the U.S. put under this umbrella called the special groups that were it is backed by Iran and was in fact one of the militias that the U.S. put under as Kataib Hezbollah. It is backed by Iran and was in fact one of the militias that the U.S. put under this umbrella called the special groups that were especially active in targeting the U.S. military back during the days of the U.S.-led occupation of Iraq. The militia itself has said that at least some 25 people were killed, another 51 injured in these strikes. They put out a statement calling on their forces to begin preparing and planning for more operations to push, as they said, the enemy America out of the country. Now, Iraq's caretaker Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi has called these strikes a violation of Iraq's sovereignty. He was informed that the strikes would take place about half an hour before they did. He then asked that the U.S. restrain. America, however, as we know, did not, and he is warning of a grave escalation. Now, the U.S. has come close to retaliating against Iran in the past. If you'll remember, there were those strikes against oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, and then Iran's downing of a U.S. drone. America, however, did restrain itself on those occasions. In this case, these particular attacks were in response to an attack outside of Kirkuk on a facility that was housing U.S. military personnel that ended up killing one U.S. contractor. Of course, the great concern in all of this is that if this situation escalates, that is detrimental not just to the stability of Iraq, but that of the region as a whole.
رسالتنا الأولى للقوات الأمريكية: مهما قصفتم، مهما ضربتم، مهما قتلتم، نحن باقون، نحن أبناء المرجعية صامدون من أجل أرضنا ومقدساتنا وعرضنا.
هذا كل أساس ناس هذا الشيء يعطي.
The Pentagon says it carried out military strikes in Iraq and Syria targeting a militia group. Kataib Hezbollah, backed by Iran, is blamed for an attack last week that killed a U.S. civilian contractor at an Iraqi military base. U.S. officials say Sunday's strikes were retaliation. Official images showed what the Pentagon says were militia targets struck by U.S. forces. Aides to President Donald Trump called the operation successful. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo spoke after briefing Trump.
What we did was take a decisive response that makes clear what President Trump has said for months and months and months, which is that we will not stand for the Islamic Republic of Iran to take actions that put American men and women in jeopardy.
And Defense Chief Mark Esper says F-15 fighters were launched against 5 targets.
3 targets in western Iraq and 2 targets in eastern Syria that were either command and control facilities or weapons caches for Kataib Hezbollah.
Esper also warned further U.S. action was on the table. Iraqi security and militia sources said at least 25 militia fighters were killed in 3 U.S. airstrikes Sunday. The sources say 4 Kataib Hezbollah commanders were among the dead.
هذا كل أساس ناس هذا الشيء يعطي.